Stop asking candidates if they believe in climate change and start asking if they understand it. It's science, not Santa Claus.
We'll carry on doing business the way that we've always done, but we'll plant 5 trees and call it sustainability. He said to spend 150,000 rands to achieve our climate change target and build a sustainability report cost them 1.5 million rands in consultants and researchers and all the peripheral stuff. It cost them 1.5 million rands to spend 150,000 rands. And he says, if I thought about it, if I had just applied my mind for 5 minutes, I could have probably come up with that. It makes sense. Change the light bulbs. And that is the danger or the unintended consequence, I think, primarily of the sustainability movement. It's what's led to the rise in the sort of consulting industry and these gatekeepers to sustainable intellectual property or intellectual property around sustainability.
Coming up, we've become so campaign-driven, not impact-driven.
Just similarly, like, why is it important to have a diamond engagement ring? It's not important. It was a marketing campaign by De Beers in the 60s that told us that it was important to have a diamond engagement ring, right? So when you give a baby a new toy, the new toy is better than the old toy. Intrinsic nature that believes that new is better. I think it's that sort of conversations that now need to happen around the dinner tables. We start educating people and educating consumers that buying luxury brands doesn't make you a better person.
And to be honest and frank, is a lot of companies don't innovate anymore and have lost the ability to innovate unless they buy a company that is innovative.
So, I mean, performance management is a beautiful tool, but it disincentivizes innovation. And if employees were not risk averse, they'd be entrepreneurs. Risk aversion is entrenched in business models.
It's true, right?
That was wild.
You are about to go on a journey where your mind will be transformed with a conversation with developmental economist Kalnisha Singh. We talk about the unintended consequence of sustainability and how we have lost our African values, the wisdom deficit, how companies stopped innovating and why that is. We even go into understanding greenwashing from a different perspective and even the revolution of consumption. This is such a powerful conversation. I can't tell you how happy I am to bring this to you. So sit back, relax, grab a pen and paper and a notepad with a cup of coffee and enjoy. Welcome everyone to today's conversation where we dive into one of the most pressing and thought-provoking topics in the world today. Sustainability and its unintended consequences. Joining us is an incredible leader who brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in this field, Kalnisha Singh. Kalnisha is deeply engaged in addressing global challenges through innovative approaches with a keen focus on the intersection of sustainability, economic development, and social impact. She has been at the forefront of understanding how sustainability initiatives can sometimes have surprising or even unintended effects. And today she'll share her insights and what it means to build a truly sustainable future. Kalnisha.
How's it?
How's it? Listen, such a formal introduction for a friend. I'm just saying. Listen, I could just see her looking at me going, oh my God, Carmen.
That was wild.
But it's true, right? I'm your hype girl.
Fantastic. I'll take it any day.
Okay, so it's the first time we're actually having this conversation face to face.
Yes.
Because we've had these webinars series and we're still going to expand on it. So keep an eye out on our social platforms. But I really think that, this journey with you and learning about sustainability is so complex. It's not an easy topic, right?
Not at all. And it's not superficial either. Right?
No.
It's quite in-depth. It has to be quite intentional if you're having a meaningful conversation about it or developing meaningful strategy.
100%. So I want to read a quote, right? I saw it this morning and I thought I'm going to actually open with that. So stop asking candidates if they believe in climate change and start asking if they understand it. it's science, not Santa Claus. Now, I know that's provocative, but it did raise a question, yes, it is a lot of science. And do we as ordinary citizens really understand what sustainability is? And do we really understand, the consequences? I must tell you, before we even get into that, so you remember the Join Who movement where we're busy getting a lot of initiatives registered with conscious leaders. We asked them a question around the SDGs and what SDGs are they representing in their initiatives. And the fascinating thing is with all the registrations we've had, not one single one went for responsible consumerism.
That's fascinating. Also fascinating, but not surprising. Right.
Why do you think that is, though?
So in countries like South Africa, emerging economies, where there's such a big divide between people that have access and people that don't have access, consumption, the act of consumption, is aspirational, right? So 80% of our population in South Africa don't have access to economic participation. They can't go to the shop and buy something just because they want to. And that's what they aspire to. People want jobs, people want employment, people want money so that they can go to the shops and buy stuff to serve their needs, to feed their kids. So consumption is aspirational, right? At this stage in the development of our economy, it's a lot to assume that people understand what consumerism is and that they are willing to sacrifice their ambition for the sake of global sustainability.
Yeah. And I also feel, one of the things that's really bothering me is the dumping yards and how garbage from all over the world are being dumped into poor third world countries. Why is that happening?
Sure. That's a question, Carmen.
I know it's a heavy question, but it bothers me because in the name of sustainability, once again, the poor suffer and the people that are more disadvantaged. And then when they are in a position where they have wealth, of course they're going to want to be able to have the things that they've never had. So there's a lot of trauma, especially in our country, and the disadvantages that we've had. So I guess my question is, are we applying foresight into how we are running the operation and the structures around sustainability, or is it just, once again, a tick box exercise?
So that's a very deep question, and I'll answer that question. So from a corporate perspective, sustainability over the years has been an exercise in risk mitigation. So corporates, the private sector, understand the risks associated with not being sustainable and not employing sustainability practices. There's a whole narrative around social license to operate, that consumers are becoming more aware and therefore are engaging with companies that are seen to be more sustainable, more green, more environmentally friendly, more consumer conscious. So it's an exercise in risk mitigation in order to avoid the risks of being seen or being perceived as unsustainable. We'll engage in activity that makes us seem sustainable. But perception, the management of perception is the key ingredient, right, in that risk mitigation framework. We do business the way we've always done it, but now we need to manage the risks associated with it. And that is the danger or the unintended consequence, I think, primarily of the sustainability movement. It's what's led to the rise in the sort of consulting industry and these gatekeepers to sustainable intellectual property or intellectual property around sustainability. It's what's increased the cost of being sustainable, right? Because now it's not just engaging or investing in sustainable practices. We also need to invest in the communications around it and the marketing around it. And then the additional layer of ESG reporting is the independent evaluation of our sustainable choices, right? So it's added to the cost of sustainability. And because now sustainability from a corporate perspective has become so expensive, its unintended consequence is greenwashing. Well, we can't afford all of these things. So we're just going to fib a little bit, right? And repackage our existing activities in a way that makes us seem more conscious, more environmentally friendly, more sustainable.
Can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
Are you saying greenwashing is a conscious decision to do it, or is it unintended?
So it could be both.
Okay.
Right. What I'm saying is that in the worst case scenario where it's intentional, where greenwashing is intentional, it's the corporate or the private sector entity or the entity says, I'm not prepared to do anything differently. Can you please repackage what I am doing currently in a way that speaks, a green language, a sustainable language? And, wordsmiths and copywriters, and you can dress things up, right? And that's sort of superficial greenwashing. But also you have the situation where somebody is tasked with greening a supply chain or implementing sustainability practices in the organization, and they're engaged with, consultants who then impose a product or impose a service on them that is sold as maybe addressing their concerns or achieving that level of compliance, right? Unless the mechanisms of the business actually shift towards sustainability, repackaging what you're doing or what you've been doing all along as something now sustainable is greenwashing, right? Just painting everything with a green brush. We'll carry on doing business the way that we've always done, but we'll plant 5 trees and call it sustainability, right? It's greenwashing. So the intention of the sustainability movement that started in the 1980s was to change the way that business is being done, right? Acknowledging the environmental implications or the environmental damage that was being done by business at that stage, understanding the social challenges that were imposed by businesses up until that point. And I mean, if we have to talk about a history of economics, right, the private sector has grown over the last few hundred years on the basis of extractive models. And we've had this conversation. What does extraction mean? Extraction means I'll take something for free and then I will create economic value from it. So the mines dig gold and coal and platinum and diamonds out of the ground for next to nothing. And then they create value in the market for that good. But if we go back even further, the 1500s, the 1600s, capitalists extracted people in the slave trade and created economic value for them in other parts of the world, right? And built a business around trading people. So natural resources, people are a natural resource. So the foundations of business, the foundations of the private sector, the foundations of most economies in the world right now are built on those extractive principles, right? We'll take what we can for as cheap as we can and use it to profit, right? The sustainability movement that started again in the 1980s was around how do we account for the damage that we're doing? Damage to people, damage to the environment, damage to systems, the damage, right? And not just account for them, but start changing our practices so that we stop doing damage. So it's not enough to pay reparations. We actually need to fix our behavior.
And it's a tough ask, right? Because, and I'm just going to be very honest. So I'm every day when I cook, or every day when I'm doing something in the kitchen, or when I'm disposing of a electronic printer or something that doesn't work, we don't build things to last. We have become so accustomed to go into a shop and just pick whatever we want, and then how often does your vegetables go rotten because you don't use everything? And it really also just comes down also to education of how do I actually live sustainable, where I feel like we can learn a lot more from communities and how we can live more sustainable, because they make everything stretch and they work with everything that they've got, whatever's in season, that kind of conversation. Whereas I feel when I look at TV and I just look at people just taking water and playing games, or on TikTok, and people just, taking everything for granted, I wonder how much responsibility are we taking as human beings for our behavior towards the planet?
So we don't take much responsibility at all, right?
And it's like, is it even worth it to educate? Because is anybody going to listen? Like, how do you even tackle this thing?
So, I mean, what's really interesting...
I can see your face like, Carmen, why are you asking me such questions?
No, so I mean, it's the real questions, right? Because we can have the superficial conversation about what corporates need to do. But the reality is that the experience we're now having with the private sector and the public sector and everyone that's trying to paint their existence with a green brush, which is what the world is trying to do right now, is that they are not interrogating, they're not looking inside. And that's exactly what we as individuals need to do as well, is look inside. There needs to be this reflection, because integrating sustainability into our lives is not an unusual ask for human beings, right? In principle and intrinsically, we all understand our role in nature and how nature works around us. We know that when we're feeling stressed and we're feeling overwhelmed, it takes a walk in the garden or a walk in a green space to center us and to ground us. And that's exactly our relationship with nature, right? We inextricably linked with the world around us, the natural world around us. So if we had to tap into like our inner wisdom, right, around this stuff, and sort of release ourselves from all the marketing messages that we get, from all the, the information that has been imposed upon us, we will very, very naturally tend towards a more sustainable way of living, right? It's the difference between, taking a handful of pills every morning and changing your diet, right? And we know that by changing our diet, we are naturally tending towards a more sustainable way of life. It's cheaper, firstly, whichever way you look at it. Eating well is a lot cheaper than taking medication or even vitamins. Taking ourselves for a walk and getting a bit of exercise is a lot cheaper in the long run than, being on injections for diabetes later on, or dealing with heart disease, or whatever the medical condition is. We intrinsically know what we need as humans. And we need to apply the same instinctive method to how we exist in the world, and how we exist at work, how we exist with our kids, how we exist as part of society. And that will naturally tend us towards a more sustainable pathway, right? The reason the extraction seemed allowable back in the day is because people dehumanized other people. It's okay for me to see you as something I can trade because I don't see you as human anymore.
But has that really changed?
It hasn't. And that's why I say the introspection is so needed. And as much as we say that we are more conscious human beings in this day and age, we know that when a big organization needs to save costs, the first thing they do is retrench people. And they're not people anymore, they're headcount. We're reducing our headcount, right? It's that fundamental systemic dehumanization of individuals, of people, which is why we have all of these social risks that still persist in the world. But similarly, we've defined ourselves as independent of the environment.
That's the problem.
As though we can exist independently of the environment, which you and I both know and everyone knows is a complete fallacy, right? We're not yet, technology is not yet at the space where we can all log into VR and, or be plugged in like batteries in the Matrix, right? The environment, we still rely on the environment to exist.
Yeah.
Right? And we will for generations. So we can't ignore our impact.
That's very deep. And, just reflecting on what you're saying, like dehumanizing of human beings, it reminds me of that ESG webinar series that we had with Dr. Sane and Dr. Carmen Murray, where we were talking about, for the system to change, the language needs to change. This disregard for humanity has also led to something quite profound. I'm really struggling at the moment to see the balance between artificial world and authentic world, where we are trading off our authenticity one prompt at a time, and handing it over to the powers that be. And I'm not against AI, but I I do believe that we need to look at both sides of the coin. And I was having a conversation the other day around people that don't want to actually handle human beings and say, like, I'd rather have AI agents as a workforce than having to deal with human beings because they're way too complex. That to me is concerning, because we need to, if we lose touch with each other and our human connection, of course we're not going to be tolerant of each other, because in there is a lesson for us both and something we both need to learn.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, the more we start isolating ourselves from our own humanity, why would we care about the planet and the environment if we can't even care about each other?
Was that a question? So
Just a philosophy, a question. I don't know if there's an answer to it, but I mean, that's just my view.
It is really interesting, because a lot of the isolation that we're feeling now is very much as a result of the sort of elevation of Western values and values of the global North above what we intrinsically know as African values or Eastern values or values of the global South. And what is dangerous is that we haven't acknowledged what drove those Western values, right? So, for example, the American dream is that you leave home when you're 18 years old, you find your own place, and you enter the economy, right, as an 18-year-old kid. And that's when kids have to access student loans to go to university. They've got to find apartments. They start working part-time jobs. And it's about keeping the wheel turning. But why is it so important to leave home when you're 18? Right? And we would say, just similarly, like, why is it important to have a diamond engagement ring? It's not important. It was a marketing campaign by De Beers in the 60s that told us that it was important to have a diamond engagement ring. But we're not interrogating the motives of why this is how things have to be. Right? And that's the danger. And if we don't interrogate the motives of why this is how it should be, or why society tells me this, or why the economy tells me this, we're never going to be making decisions for ourselves. Right? So the 18-year-old in the US that is laden with student debt, that has to go try find his way in the economy, right, can't afford to feed himself right now because minimum wage doesn't buy you groceries, can't afford the student debt, so he's going to be in debt until he dies, right? Can't go back home to his mom because what will people say and what will people think? So where is he? Completely isolated.
Sure. Never thought about it that way, but it's insane.
Right? It's just insane. Whereas the culture that I come from, I could go home to my mom at any time and she'll welcome me back with open arms. We live in multi-generational households, and it's completely fine and acceptable and more sustainable. Right? Because it's home-cooked food every day. The old people are taken care of because they're living at home. The young people are taken care of. There's no need for babysitters because there's always someone at home. Right? I don't have to worry or stress about being homeless and not being a productive member of society, and I will never be isolated. It's the same for many African families. Right? Everyone always talks about going home for Christmas, and home means going back home to where their grannies are or where their parents come from. Because home is always a welcome place. Right? But the model of society we've chosen to adopt encourages isolation.
And I think for one of the things that really bothers me is the influence of globalization on our cultures and how much we are trading off and losing of our cultures. Because I think, especially in South Africa, I think we've got such beautiful cultures. And I think you and I had this conversation around people leaving the rural areas, leaving the villages, coming to the urban cities, and then learning the new way of living and being, and not relating back to their heritage, and all this wisdom that is being lost. And I don't think that we have any idea of the unintended consequences of that wisdom being lost, and the cultural essence and value systems and the way of looking at life and working with nature and appreciating nature and connecting as human beings.
Yeah. And I mean, what is the great travesty though is that when we move from one area into an urban environment, when we go from rural into city, when we go from, you know, I come from a small town as well, when we go from a small town into like the corporate world, the assumption that we make is that this new experience is a better experience. Right? So as individuals, we also start removing ourselves from our past, from our history, because as young people, new is better, always, consistently. And this is also why consumerism is the thing, because we've been trained, and so there's a lot of our intrinsic nature that believes that new is better, but we've also been trained to believe that new is better, right? When you give a baby a new toy, the new toy is better than the old toy, right? It's new and shiny, and it's that sort of simulated training that happens consistently and persistently, right? We have to be so grounded and rooted in ourselves to acknowledge the good that is with the stuff that we bring into the new space, right? And you know, you and I both know that most of us are laden with insecurity, lack of confidence, you know, self-esteem issues. Can you imagine what that feels like for a kid that grew up in the rural environment? You didn't have access to basic services that you and I, you know, rely on or take for granted. And now they're being injected into a new space, you know, through a bursary program. They get to go to Wits University, for example. It's completely new. It's a melting pot of diversity. It's great for them. But their perception is that I'm not good enough now because I come from this experience. Whereas my classmates have laptops, they know how to drive, they have the city experience. So let me try learn as much about the city experience as I can, so maybe then I'll fit in, right? And that's what it perpetually becomes. It becomes this perpetual need to fit in, which is normal. It is human nature, right? We haven't yet allowed society, allowed individuals to be okay in their difference.
Yeah. And we don't give people permission to do so. It's like the sausage factory. If we all have to act and be the same way, because if you make me uncomfortable because you're so different, you know, you don't belong here. And this constant need to fit in and having the things that other people have, having the jobs and the titles and all of that.
But even just like the iPhones or,
exactly,
you know, the stuff.
Yeah, it's you know, it's such a hard thing to find that balance, because, you know, I think for me, I almost want to go one step further. It's like when we look at sustainability, you know, corporates are dealing with a lot because there's so many regulations, and a lot of these regulations that they need to comply to is from other countries that needs to be applied. So companies have become risk averse, and to be honest and frank, is a lot of companies don't innovate anymore and have lost the ability to innovate unless they buy a company that is innovative.
Yeah.
If we look at entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are far more innovative because they're multifaceted and, you know, doing so many things and really have to operate like polymaths. My big thing is always what differences are happening that we can learn from each other in order to create a more sustainable future. And also, what is the experience for somebody at a community level? Because the NPOs are doing so well, right? They do so well on the ground at grassroots levels. Why can't corporates get it right? What is the disconnect?
It's so fascinating. So as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking we deal with corporates as though they're this individual, self-contained entity, right? But all corporates, all businesses, all entities are a sum of the parts. And the parts in a corporate structure are the individuals that make up this corporate structure, right? And if you think about the practices that people follow, and the characteristics of those individuals in those jobs, people are in their jobs because they need to be in their jobs. Nobody works a 9 to 5 because they want to, right? Especially not in South Africa. They need those jobs. So individuals are de-incentivized from rocking the boat because they need their jobs.
Yeah.
Right. The second thing is performance management processes in corporates de-incentivize innovation because you're measured against a scorecard of behavior, of performance, of character, right? You deviate from that scorecard and you become innovative, then you don't meet the metrics on the scorecard, right?
Sure.
That risks your livelihood, and most people can't afford that, right? So, I mean, performance management is a beautiful tool, but it disincentivizes innovation in a lot of places. Right.
Sure.
You also can't have the converse happening where you're not performance managing anybody and they're all left to their own devices, because then the business won't do what it's supposed to be doing. Right. So innovation is this interesting dynamic. We say that we want innovative people, but we don't necessarily allow them the room to be innovative within their workspace. And then they're scared to be innovative because I say one wrong thing or I do a few things that cost the business money and then I lose my job. Risk aversion is entrenched in business models. And if employees were not risk averse, they'd be entrepreneurs. Right? So that's the one thing. And we can't, and I've realized this in my own work, I can't deal with a corporate structure as though it's one entity. Because there are lots of different people with different motivations in that organization. And you kind of have to take the time to understand what the different motivations are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And ultimately, business is there to do a job, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I also think that there's a huge responsibility on corporates. And I mean, like, they have to take on the burdens of the world.
Yeah.
And they are like small countries.
Yeah.
The fascinating thing with our research with conscious leaders, with women empowerment as an example, what came out is like, you can teach me all the women empowerment and how we can be more, more independent, more confident and lead like a boss and do all of these things. But the moment I go home, I have to be subservient to my husband or to my culture, my family. And there's this complete disconnect. And I mean, this is where it becomes very tricky, I think, for organizations that's really trying to do such amazing work with DEI. And in cases, I believe that there's a lot of companies doing great work. But I think, it's that the moment you leave the doors of the business, you have to turn into a new person and be a new individual.
That's so fascinating. So, I mean, we can go into a whole other conversation around the unintended consequences of the DEI movement. And my sort of theory, and it's a theory of one, unresearched, is that a lot of the models that we have designed in the DEI movement, DEIB now movement, is modeled on the experience of the white man in corporate, right? So the empowerment journeys for women in those organizations, in those structures, in those programs, is to position her as equal to the white male senior leadership. It doesn't account for our natural tendencies as women, our natural characteristics as women, and it definitely doesn't speak to our natural strengths as women, right? So we are being molded to fit into that box, as opposed to the box being redefined to include us.
Oh, that's powerful.
Right. And if the box was redefined to fit us, right, engaging with the men at work would be no different to engaging with your husband at home.
Wow, that is profound. Oh gosh, I've got to sit with that for a second. That is really... Maybe that is exactly where the problem lies. The problem is not within... it is because it is not designed to actually be fluid.
Yeah. And that's what I think. And I mean, I always tell the story. The economy is not designed for women. It has never been designed for women. We need to first acknowledge that fact. Right? And I mean, my example is the toilets. Every time I go to the movies or go to the theater or even go to the shopping mall and I need to use the toilet, there's a line at the women's toilet. It's sort of an accepted norm for all of us that live in cities and have access to these things, right? It's an accepted norm that you will have to stand in line at the toilet. If the space was designed to accommodate the demands of women, right? And economic design is based on demand, consumer demand. If these spaces were designed to accommodate the demands of women, we wouldn't be standing in line.
And it's the same conversation around air conditioning that is happening. I mean, have you walked in some of these streets with our high heels when you walk in these cobble streets and you can hardly hold your balance, or in the parking lots where you can hardly walk because it's not been designed for women.
And it's like a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
The other story about seatbelts, which I didn't even know until I read an article a few months ago, was that women are about 43% more likely to be injured in a car accident. And why is that? It's because up until 2022, there were never any female crash test dummies. So cars were not tested for female passengers or drivers or anything. So every time you get in your car, it's why insurance for women is higher. Because the cars are not designed for us.
It just starts painting the picture of a systemic issue and getting to the root of it and to see the fairness of it. I mean, even if we look at menopause, right, and the unfairness around the research that was done on our bodies and, you know, the disadvantages and living in poor health for 25% of our lives, that is just like ridiculous in the time that we live in.
You have medical issues that affect 50% of the population that are still being untreated and unacknowledged. It tells us a very, very almost an unrealistic, unperceptible truth about the world.
You know, I was quite vocal on LinkedIn yesterday and this morning. There's obviously, it's awards season and there's a lot going on in the marketing arena, and there's these big panels and discussions happening, and you just see me, no woman of color, maybe 2 or 3 women on these panels. And for me, that is a big problem. And I'll tell you why, because I believe that marketing has contributed tremendously to unsustainability. But furthermore, I also believe that marketing can shape cultures. And if our voices are not in those rooms where the creatives and the innovation and the ideas and the communication that goes out to the world, if we are not included in that narrative, how is this going to be a sustainable outcome? And the fact that we are still buying products and buying, products and services from brands that are not getting the DEI thing. You know, if we continue doing that, we need to actually start using the vote of the wallet to say, okay, right, I'm not going to support this brand, not because I don't like the brand or I don't believe in the brand, but I don't believe in its values. And why is it such a tough thing for us to do?
I think it's difficult for us to do because the reality, again, in South Africa is that most people don't have access.
Yes, that's also true.
Right. So they buy the products that reach them.
Yeah. But also, just to point out, I think also for people that are disadvantaged, I don't think they have much choice on what they can buy. So sustainability behavior won't come from those masses. It needs to come from the top, right?
It needs to come from the top owners.
Yeah.
Definitely. But again, we have so many layers of stuff to deal with as individuals in order to start shifting behavior. Right?
Yeah.
And I don't believe... I think we need to question what is fair and what is just, and what we should be doing in order to start shifting those behaviors. Because I believe, and again, theory of one, I believe it's very unfair to expect somebody who has come from a rural area, and this is the first experience of the economy, to expect them to not consume, right, and not aspire to consumption, and not buy a car, and not, buy a house, not go to Pick and Pay or any retailer and shop for groceries, right? Because they've never had this experience before. In that consumption, they are already breaking generational trauma.
Yes.
Right? But what we need to do is we need to start educating people and educating consumers that buying luxury brands doesn't make you a better person. Being able to afford, European labels doesn't mean that you're better than anybody else. Maybe buying South African products, allows you to be a better person because now you're contributing to the local economy and local artisans. And that's the education that needs to need. How do we start shifting consumer behavior? How do we start conscientizing consumers around, what is valuable and what does create value, right? About production processes, because the European labels are all still produced in that, factory in China, whereas, the local artisans are literally hand making the items. They're actually selecting the leather and, designing for you instead of the masses, right? So I think it's that sort of conversations that now need to happen around the dinner tables, in our social circles. We need to start emulating that behavior. Like maybe let's stop wearing the international brands, choosing better, spending our money a bit better, right? And then we're contributing to more sustainability that way.
Yeah. Sure. That's a lot to take in, because I also feel there's also this element of balance. I mean, yes, we have been trained to want it all and to have the best, and that we will have the fanciest car, but we'll not live in the most appropriate home or live in a good area. And how we spread our money. But I think at the end of the day is that we need to start working in balance with, what is our money worth, and remembering how hard we had to work to earn that money. I'll give you an example. Marcelo Bielsa, who was a coach for Leeds United many years ago, he started coaching the football team. And, these guys earn a fortune, and he made them do community work. And he said to them, I want you to go and work in the areas where everybody, your fans are working, what they do for a living, so that you can understand the hard work that they need to do just to come and watch you play on a Saturday. And for them to know that they're playing for the fans, and that you need to respect them by understanding their lives. And I think that this is exactly as these programs that we need to start having, is if we really want to understand how we can create a better world, we need to start getting out of our boardrooms into the communities, and vice versa, and getting people from communities into the boardrooms, and have that cross-pollination, that we can have real conversations to see the different perspectives. Because I think it's so in isolation, and we rely on a lot of research houses and companies to do this research, which is very much copy and paste and working on certain models. But if you actually hear the stories rather than, how many times people will go through a question and not really understand what you're asking them or why you're asking it. But if you explained face to face to a person, I'm asking you this question because this is what I'm trying to understand, your answer will look completely different.
I have to tell you a story. So, I mean, the risk of sitting in the boardrooms and relying on the research houses and, gathering all of these insights is the money that you're spending on that exercise as a corporate leader, right? It was probably 10 years ago now. I did an exercise, or I was having a conversation with the CEO of a listed company. And he told me, we've just been on this whole sustainability trip, and I can't believe how much money it's cost. The actual action that they took was to replace all of the fluorescent light bulbs in their building with LED light bulbs. That was the action. That was the recommended action that they took. That exercise to replace all of the light bulbs probably cost them 150,000 rands at the time. It was a big building, right? He said to spend 150,000 rands to achieve our climate change target and build a sustainability report cost them 1.5 million rands in consultants and researchers and all the peripheral stuff. It cost them 1.5 million rands to spend 150,000 rands. And he says, if I thought about it, if I had just applied my mind for 5 minutes, I could have probably come up with that. It makes sense. Change the light bulbs.
Wow.
And this was 10 years ago. And that hasn't changed. So instead of people sitting around the boardroom, just taking a moment and like thinking about it logically, everybody around those tables, highly educated with worlds of experience. Instead of them sitting and just thinking about it logically, they do what corporates and private sector entities always do. They throw money at the problem. And that's not sustainable.
Yeah. And I also, just thinking about that in context is so, so true. And I think it's also to the point that you always talk about where you say, you know, why do we have to spend so much doing marketing, and then the actual idea that we implement, that we're marketing, is only making such a small impact. It's like because we've become so campaign driven, not impact driven.
Exactly. Because we are managing perceptions.
Yeah.
Not actually building sustainability.
Yeah. And the mindset has to change completely. There's so much work to do in this. And I started reading a lot of academic papers and trying to understand and the behaviors. And, you know, also there's a thing that's really fascinating to me is, and this goes back 10 years ago, of studies that reveal that companies are focusing on sustainability and trying to drive sustainability, but they can't get the consumer behavior to change.
But they don't want the consumer behavior to change, because consumer behavior is driving their profitability.
Yeah.
Oof, so it's intense. My, again, theory of one is that companies say that they can't change customer behavior, but they actually have no impetus to try. Well, am I actually going to tell you to buy less of my services or products?
No, never.
I want you to buy the new version when it comes out in pink.
Yeah.
Right? So.
As I said, companies stopped innovating a long time ago. So, yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But the thing is, we can do such amazing things if we actually apply our minds.
Yeah.
And I think what really resonated with me is this whole idea of the fear of innovation, because I need to take my salary at the end of the month, and this risk averseness. And maybe if we took a day off and say, okay, right, there's no rules. If we could reinvent anything in this business, how would we do it? What little plans can we put in place? I think, we'd be in such a better place. But at the end of the day is, you need buy-in from the biggest stakeholders, especially if you're a listed company. Things get very tricky when you're listed.
So things do get tricky when you're listed. But my sort of challenge to everyone is, all the corporates we've come across, especially in South Africa, are spending so much money right now on achieving compliance from a sustainability perspective. So sustainability in South Africa means many things, right? It's occupational health and safety, it's employment equity, it's broad-based Black economic empowerment, it is writing your integrated reports if you are listed, a sustainability reporting, ESG reporting now if you have, if you have investors. So sustainability is that whole myriad of exercises, right? And companies are spending so much money on that whole myriad of exercises because they are dealing with them independently of each other. But they're not independent activities because they're all under this umbrella of sustainability, right? The challenge is, take a step back and look at all of these things that you are doing and throwing money at, and look for ways to innovate in that space. And I can guarantee you that's where the innovation sits. And I'll give you an example of the mines, right? Currently, the mines, and mines especially that are expanding, are spending so much money on relocating people. They relocate villages. It's almost a daily occurrence, right? But the money that they're spending to relocate people can actually propel those people into the middle class. The average cost of relocation right now that we've seen over the last 2 years is about 2.2 million rands per household.
Sure.
2.2 million rands per household is a huge asset injection for that household.
Sure.
It's the kind of money that those households will never see.
Yeah.
So if you could spend that money with the framing of I can now afford to move this family into the middle class, what will I do differently?
Yes, see.
And that's free consulting advice.
Free consulting. Hashtag. Wow. But the thing is also, do you remember that Move the Bus? Do you remember those days where they'll go and they'll build a whole new house for them, and like their house is like in a disaster? But there was also a lot of people, and just to add to your point, that moved that bus, they couldn't maintain the house after they built it. And I think that that's also something to take into consideration. If you're going to move them into upper class, they must be able to sustain living at that bracket.
And that's exactly it, though, because the mines are compelled to invest every year for 20 years. If you're investing every year for 20 years, you're holding a generation of this community in the palm of your hands. Right? But we need to think about it differently. We need to stop thinking about it as a year-by-year exercise and think about the whole generation. And imagine being a sustainability officer at a mining company and having the power to influence a whole generation around you. The power and the budget.
Wow.
It's a game changer.
Sure. I think you and I should go into sustainability at mining, right? I wouldn't know what to do there, but that's profound.
But it's also the power and the responsibility that people shirk away from because of their own stuff.
Now, the other question that I want to ask you is, if that is the case, there must be a lot of different perceptions for communities. How do they experience everything that the corporates and the mining and the industries are doing for them? Is there a resentment? Is there maybe riots happening that we don't know of?
So there's lots of unhappiness.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unhappiness. So for the last, I would say close on 30 years in South Africa, every sort of large-scale project, so if it's a new mine, if it's a road, if it's a bridge, if it's a large-scale project, has had what we call transformative obligations built into the contracting, right? So those transformative obligations are either like a contribution to local economic development, definitely the environmental management stuff, definitely skills development activities, definitely BEE compliance, which is local procurement, contributions to socioeconomic development. So for the last 30 years, shy of 30 years. And if you think about the quantum of money that has been directed towards that sort of transformative objectives, we would expect, if it was spent well and successfully, that we'd have a different country right now. But the reality is that every community around these projects are still living in exactly the same conditions that they've always lived in, bar one or two success stories or a handful of success stories.
Sure.
And the thing is, we always hear the success stories. We always hear about the kid that got a bursary and then shot the lights out, entered the economy, is doing really well. We don't hear about the 20 colleagues that he had that didn't do so well. So it's things like that. So, and the challenge is communities have now seen this activity for the last 30 years, for a whole generation. And they read on social media the annual reports and the press releases that go out that talk about the wonderful things that these organizations are doing. And they're like, but that's not true, because that's not my reality and I'm from this community. And I see the harm that's being done, so there's no reconciliation. And I think the problem is, there's lots of different problems, but the biggest problem I feel is that the organizations that are organizations, mines, infrastructure projects, energy companies, all of them that are working in these communities, the big mistake that they make is that they don't realize that the communities are as connected as the rest of us, right? They might be offline for 5 days, but the day that they get data, they're on social media, they're checking everything out, and everybody's following everybody. It's a connected generation. So the stuff that you are selling in terms of your public relations is also landing in those communities. And if there is a disconnect, right, if the flowery language doesn't meet the reality on the ground, communities will be unhappy. And it creates sustained unhappiness. And then that unhappiness plays out in lots of different ways. It plays out as protests, it plays out as extortion, it plays out as, requests for illicit activity, it plays out as crime. But the root cause is the disconnect between action and communication.
Sure. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to think about. I think in summary, and taking everything that we've discussed, I mean, if you could tie it up for us based on all of the unintended consequences of sustainability, what is the way forward? What does that map look like? And what do we need to start paying attention to try and see how in our own operating environments that we are thinking about both sides of the coin and how we can implement our strategies more effectively?
So I think I'm going to answer your question specifically, exclusively looking at South Africa, right? I think as South African companies, and you and I have had this conversation before, we are very uniquely positioned in this world of sustainability, because since the 1990s, our regulatory framework has encouraged us towards sustainability. So as a South African business, if you are adhering to the basic conditions of employment, the Skills Development Act, the BEE codes, the Environmental Management Act, if you are complying with the regulatory environment in this country, you are naturally tending towards sustainable business practice, right? The opportunity is for you to take this baseline of compliance and then catalyze it to actually shift what's happening in the world. Right. So instead of dealing with it as a checkbox exercise, let's elevate it to a strategic level, design a 5 or a 10-year strategy, and then make more intentional investments towards sustainability, because you already have the foundation. You don't have to start from scratch. Right. The second thing is, do the interrogation. Ask why. Why do I feel compelled to do an ESG report this year? Is it because an investor is telling me to? Is it because I've read some, interesting things in Financial Times? Like, why do I want to embark on this exercise? Because you and I both know that unless your why is solid, unless the intention is sound, the outcome's never going to be, solid. Right? So interrogate the why. And if it's a compelling enough why, then yes, by all means, go ahead. If you're still unsure, maybe have conversations with your peers in the industry and find out what's going on. But then know that you have a baseline. If you have achieved legislative compliance already in your business, you have a baseline from which to work. You don't need, and I'm a consultant, so this is me, destroying my own industry. You don't need expensive consultants to tell you what to do, right? If you intend to do the right thing.
That's deep. Well, I want to say thank you so much. I always love having these conversations with you. And every time I listen to you, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so good. This is so, there's so much to learn. But I think this is, for me, I learn through conversation. I learn through really understanding worlds, because there's just too much information out there to try and just to make it your own. But I do think that to go deep is vital. Okay, anything else from you?
No, that's it.
That's it. Are you done now?
I'm done.
I could just see.
What a day.
To our audience, thank you so much for joining us, having this conversation. And I hope that you've learned a bit. And if there's any questions that you might have, please get in touch and follow the links below if you want to learn more about Kalnisha. And thank you so much for being part of this journey and learning with us as we're on the go. Have a good one. Bye-bye now.